The morning sun cast long shadows across the Naval Special Warfare Training Center as Lieutenant Sarah Chun adjusted her gear one final time. Around her, 23 other candidates prepared for what would be their most challenging exercise yet. The difference was obvious to everyone present. She was the only woman among them. "Look at this," muttered Petty Officer Jackson, loud enough for several others to hear. "Command's really scraping the bottom of the barrel now, aren't they?" His comment drew snickers from a few nearby candidates. "What's next? Bringing in kindergartners?" Sarah kept her eyes focused on checking her rifle scope, though her jaw tightened slightly. She had heard variations of this conversation dozens of times over the past 8 months of training. The whispers followed her everywhere, in the mess hall, during physical training, even in the brief moments of downstairs between exercises. Commander Rodriguez stepped forward, his weathered face showing no emotion as he surveyed the group. 20 years of leading special operations had taught him to read people quickly, and he could see the tension rippling through the assembled candidates like heat waves off asphalt. "Today's exercise simulates a high-value target elimination in urban terrain," he announced, his voice carrying easily across the training ground. "Intelligence indicates 8 enemy snipers have taken positions throughout the mock city. Your mission is simple: locate and neutralize all threats while protecting civilian assets." The mock city sprawled before them, a carefully constructed maze of buildings, alleyways, and rooftops that had been designed to replicate the complexity of real urban combat zones. Every window could hide a threat. Every corner could conceal an ambush. It was the kind of environment where split-second decisions meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. "Time limit is 30 minutes, Rodriguez continued. "Any candidate who fails to neutralize at least 6 targets will be dropped from the program immediately." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the group. "Any questions?" Silence stretched across the training ground like a hell breath. Sarah felt the weight of 24 pairs of eyes on her, measuring, judging, waiting for her to crack under the pressure. She had felt this scrutiny every single day since arriving at the training center, but it had never been quite this intense. "Chun," Rodriguez called out, causing her to snap to attention. "You're up first." The announcement sent a ripple of surprise through the other candidates. Traditionally, the exercise rotation followed alphabetical order by last name, which would have put Sarah somewhere in the middle of the group. Being selected to go first meant one of two things. Either Rodriguez wanted to get her inevitable failure out of the way early, or he was testing something else entirely. "Yes, sir," Sarah responded crisply, stepping forward with her weapon at the ready. As she moved toward the entrance of the mock city, the comments began in earnest. They were meant to be whispered, but in the desert stillness, every word carried clearly to her ears. $20 says she doesn't make it past the first building," someone muttered. "I'll take that bet," another voice replied. "I'm thinking she gets lost and calls for extraction within 10 minutes. This is what happens when politics gets involved in special ops," a third candidate added with disgust. "Standards get lowered to make everyone feel good." Sarah paused at the entrance, her hand resting on the door handle. For just a moment, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she was facing. Not just the exercise ahead, but everything it represented. Every assumption about her capabilities. Every doubt about whether she belonged here. Every whispered conversation about lowered standards and political correctness. She thought about her father, a Marine sniper who had taught her to shoot when she was 12 years old. He had never treated her differently because she was a girl. If anything, he had pushed her harder than he might have pushed his son. "Excuses are just fear wearing a disguise," he used to say. "Show them what you can do, not what they think you can't." The door opened with a soft creak, and Sarah stepped into the mock city. Behind her, she could hear Rodriguez calling out to the other candidates to take positions around the observation tower, where they could watch her performance on the monitors. She knew they were expecting a show, just not the kind she was planning to give them. The first building was a 3-story apartment complex with multiple entry points and windows. Sarah moved through it with practiced efficiency, her rifle sweeping left and right as she cleared each room. Her movements were fluid, economical, the result of countless hours of training that had begun long before she ever set foot in this place. At the age of 16, she had been shooting competitively at the state level. By 18, she had earned a scholarship to study military science at the Naval Academy. Her marksmanship scores had caught the attention of her instructors immediately, not just because they were exceptional, but because of the way she approached each shot with mathematical precision. The first sniper was positioned on the second floor of the apartment building, his rifle barrel barely visible through a window that had been designed to look like it was covered with newspapers. Sarah spotted the telltale glint of his scope lens from 40 yards away. She didn't hesitate. Her shot took him clean through the center mass. The target system registered an immediate kill, and a red light flashed to indicate the first enemy neutralized. The timer on her wrist showed that 2 minutes and 30 seconds had elapsed. Moving through the building's rear exit, Sarah found herself in an alleyway that connected to the main street of the mock city. This was where the exercise would typically become more challenging. The snipers would be positioned to cover each other, making it nearly impossible to approach any one position without being exposed to fire from another. But Sarah had spent the previous 3 weeks studying this training ground during her off hours. While the other candidates were in the recreation hall playing cards or complaining about their aching muscles, she had been walking the perimeter, noting sight lines and angles, memorizing the layout until she could navigate it blindfolded. The second sniper had taken position on a water tower that overlooked the main street. It was a smart choice, elevated position, excellent field of view, multiple escape routes. Unfortunately for him, Sarah had identified this exact position as a priority target during her reconnaissance. She moved through a drainage tunnel that ran beneath the main street, emerging behind a concrete barrier that put her at a 90-degree angle to the sniper's position. He never saw her coming. The shot echoed off the surrounding buildings, and another red light flashed in the distance. For minutes, 12 seconds elapsed. Back in the observation tower, the mood among the watching candidates had shifted noticeably. The easy jokes and confident predictions had given way to focused attention as they watched Sarah's progress on the monitors. "She's moving faster than anyone expected," one of them observed quietly. "Lucky shots," Jackson replied, but there was less conviction in his voice than there had been earlier. "Let's see how she handles the hard part." The hard part, as every candidate knew, would be the central plaza where the remaining 6 snipers had established a crossfire pattern that covered every possible approach. It was designed to be nearly impossible for a single operator to breach without taking casualties. Most candidates would spend 15 to 20 minutes just trying to identify safe routes through the maze of overlapping fields of fire. Sarah crouched behind an overturned vehicle at the edge of the plaza, studying the buildings that surrounded the open space. She could see muzzle flashes from at least 4 different positions as the snipers engaged training targets to maintain the illusion of an active combat zone. Their positions were well chosen, professionally executed. They had made only one mistake. They were fighting the exercise they expected, not the one she was bringing to them. Instead of trying to work her way around the plaza or find a covered approach, Sarah did something that none of the observers anticipated. She climbed. The building behind her was a 4-story office complex with external fire escapes and a flat roof. Sarah scaled it with the efficiency of someone who had spent countless hours in climbing gyms and obstacle courses. Within 3 minutes, she was on the roof with a commanding view of the entire plaza. From this elevated position, she could see exactly what the exercise designers had intended, a complex puzzle of angles and cover that would challenge even the most experienced operators. But she could also see something else. The snipers, focused on watching the street-level approaches, had left themselves exposed to observation from above. Sarah's rifle was equipped with a variable scope that could adjust from close-quarter to long-range targeting. She dialed it to maximum magnification and began systematically identifying her targets. The third sniper was positioned in a second-story window of the building directly across from her. Clean shot, no obstructions. The fourth sniper had taken cover behind an air conditioning unit on a neighboring rooftop. He thought he was invisible from ground level, but from Sarah's position, she could see him clearly. The 5th and 6th snipers were working as a team from the top floor of the tallest building in the plaza. They had set up a crossfire pattern that would catch anyone trying to move through the main street. Unfortunately for them, they had positioned themselves near large windows that gave Sarah perfect sight lines. What happened next will be talked about in special operations training circles for years to come. Sarah didn't just engage the targets. She orchestrated a sequence of shots that eliminated them so quickly that the enemy snipers never had time to identify where the fire was coming from. Her first shot took down a sniper in the second-story window. Before the sound of the gunshot had finished echoing off the buildings, she had already shifted to her second target. The sniper behind the air conditioning unit fell 3 seconds later. The 2 snipers in the tall building realized they were under attack, but couldn't identify the source of the incoming fire. They began scanning the surrounding rooftops, but Sarah had already moved to a different position on her building. Her third and fourth shots came from a new angle, eliminating both targets before they could effectively return fire. The 7th sniper had been positioned in a basement window, covering the approach to the plaza from the east. He had the best cover of any of the targets, with only a narrow, firing port visible from most angles. Sarah adjusted her position one more time, lying flat on the roof edge to get the precise angle she needed. The shot required threading the bullet through a gap that was barely 6 inches wide. She made it look easy. The 8th and final sniper had been placed in the most challenging position of all, inside a mock civilian building where engagement required absolute precision to avoid injuring the mannequins representing noncombatants. Sarah studied the target through her scope for nearly 30 seconds, identifying the exact window where the sniper had positioned himself and calculating the angle needed to ensure a clean shot. When she finally pulled the trigger, the bullet passed through the designated target zone and struck its mark with surgical precision. The final red light flashed, indicating mission completion. Sarah checked her timer, 11 minutes, 47 seconds. She had not only completed the exercise in record time, but had done so without sustaining any simulated injuries and without compromising any civilian assets. She made her way back down to ground level and walked calmly toward the observation tower where Rodriguez and the other candidates were waiting. The silence that greeted her was different from the hostile quiet she had faced at the beginning of the exercise. This was the silence of people processing something they hadn't expected to see. Rodriguez was staring at the exercise computer display, cross-referencing the results against previous performances. In 15 years of running this particular exercise, no candidate had ever achieved a perfect score in under 20 minutes. Most took the full 30 minutes and still missed 1 or 2 targets. Time, he called out unnecessarily, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been surprise. Sarah approached the group and stopped at attention, waiting for the debriefing that would determine whether she had passed or failed this crucial milestone. Around her, the other candidates stood in complete silence, their earlier confidence replaced by something that looked very much like shock. The morning sun was climbing higher now, and the desert heat was beginning to build. But the temperature Sarah felt wasn't coming from the sun. It was coming from the sudden shift in how 23 highly trained military personnel were looking at her. The mockery was gone. The assumptions were cracking, and the real test was just beginning. Commander Rodriguez studied the computer display for a long moment before speaking. The numbers were clear: perfect accuracy, record time, 0 civilian casualties, 0 simulated injuries sustained. It was the kind of performance that training instructors dream about, but rarely see, even from the most experienced candidates. 11 minutes, 47 seconds, he announced to the assembled group. 8 targets, 8 kills, 0 complications. His weathered face remained neutral, but Sarah caught something in his tone that hadn't been there before. That's a new course record. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah had expected some reaction from the other candidates, maybe grudging acknowledgement, perhaps continued skepticism about whether her performance was somehow artificial or lucky. What she hadn't expected was the complete absence of sound, as if 23 people had simultaneously forgotten how to breathe. Petty Officer Jackson was the first to find his voice. Computer malfunction, he suggested weakly, gesturing toward the display screen. Maybe the targeting system wasn't calibrated properly. Rodriguez turned toward Jackson with the kind of look that had been perfected during 2 decades of dealing with enlisted personnel who questioned orders. Are you suggesting that our equipment suddenly developed flaws in the 15 minutes since it was tested this morning, Petty Officer? No, sir, Jackson replied quickly, his face reddening. Just seems unusual. Unusual, Rodriguez repeated slowly, as if tasting the word. Let me tell you what's unusual, Petty Officer. What's unusual is that in 15 years of running this exercise, I've seen exactly 4 candidates achieve a perfect score. 2 of them went on to become SEAL Team 6 operators. 1 became a military sniper instructor. The 4th died in Afghanistan while protecting his unit from enemy fire. The weight of that comparison settled over the group like a heavy blanket. Sarah felt the shift in attention, but kept her expression neutral. She had learned early in her military career that showing too much emotion, whether pride or relief, could be interpreted as weakness or arrogance. The targeting system is working perfectly, Rodriguez continued. The exercise parameters were identical to every previous iteration. The only variable that changed today was the operator. He paused, his gaze moving slowly across the faces of the assembled candidates. Questions. Master Chief Petty Officer Williams stepped forward from where he had been observing near the back of the group. Williams was a legend in special operations circles, a man who had completed more combat missions than most people had hot meals. His presence at the training center was both an honor and an intimidation factor for the candidates. I'd like to review the footage, Williams said quietly. It wasn't a request. Rodriguez nodded toward the observation tower. Monitor room. Full video coverage from 12 different angles. The group moved toward the tower in a procession that felt more like a funeral march than a training debrief. Sarah found herself walking slightly apart from the others, conscious of the way conversations stopped when she passed and started up again in whispers after she had moved on. The monitor room was cramped, designed to accommodate maybe 6 people comfortably. With 26 bodies crammed inside, the air quickly became warm and close. Williams took position at the primary display console while Rodriguez worked the controls. Starting from entry point, Rodriguez announced, and the main screen flickered to life. Sarah watched herself on the monitor, seeing the exercise from an external perspective for the first time. The cameras had captured every movement, every decision, every shot. What she saw surprised her, not because of what she had done, but because of how it looked to outside observers. Her movements through the buildings were economical and purposeful, but they also revealed something else. While other candidates typically approached urban combat exercises with obvious caution, checking and rechecking corners, she had moved with the confidence of someone who already knew what was around each corner. Pause there, Williams instructed as the footage reached Sarah's approach to the first sniper position. Back it up 30 seconds. Rodriguez complied, and they watched again as Sarah identified the sniper's position and took her shot. Williams leaned closer to the screen, studying the sequence frame by frame. She spotted the target from 40 yards, Williams observed. At that distance, the scope reflection would have been barely visible. Most people wouldn't have caught it. Maybe she got lucky, suggested another candidate from the back of the room. Williams didn't turn around. Let's see. They continued through the footage, watching Sarah's systematic elimination of each target. With each shot, the comments from the assembled candidates became fewer and further between. By the time they reached the sequence where Sarah engaged 6 targets from the rooftop position, the room was completely silent except for the sound of the video playback. Stop, Williams commanded as the footage showed Sarah's final shot, the precision strike that eliminated the 8th sniper through the narrow window while avoiding civilian casualties. Williams stood up slowly, his joints creaking audibly in the quiet room. He had been studying military tactics and marksmanship for 30 years and he had never seen anything quite like what they had just witnessed. Range estimation, he asked Rodriguez. Rodriguez consulted his notes. Final target was at 212 meters. Angle of descent approximately 22 degrees. Window opening was measured at 6.3 inches. Williams whistled softly, threading a bullet through a 6-inch gap at over 200 meters, while accounting for elevation and wind drift. He turned to look at Sarah directly for the first time since the exercise had begun. "What did you train?" "Multiple locations, Master Chief," Sarah replied. "Quantico, Camp Pendleton, private ranges in Virginia and North Carolina." "Who was your primary marksmanship instructor?" Sarah hesitated for just a moment. This was always the complicated part of the conversation. "My father, Master Chief. Retired Marine Gunnery Sergeant James Chun." Recognition flickered in Williams' eyes. "Jimmy Chun? From 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines." "Yes, Master Chief." Williams was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Jimmy Chun was another special operations legend, a sniper whose exploits during the Gulf War and early operations in Afghanistan had become the stuff of training manual case studies. The man had retired with more confirmed kills than most entire sniper teams accumulated over full careers. "When did you start training with him?" Williams asked. "Age 12, Master Chief. Started with basic marksmanship, progressed to advanced techniques through high school and college." The room was becoming increasingly uncomfortable, and not just because of the close quarters. Sarah could feel the weight of everyone's attention, but the quality of that attention had changed dramatically over the past 20 minutes. The mockery and dismissive comments had been replaced by something more complex, a mixture of surprise, respect, and perhaps a bit of resentment. "Let me understand this correctly," Williams continued. "You've been training under one of the Corps' most decorated snipers since you were 12 years old?" "Yes, Master Chief." "And during your time at the Naval Academy, what was your marksmanship classification?" Sarah kept her expression neutral, though she knew this question would provoke another reaction. "Expert marksman, all 4 years. Range officer for the Academy Rifle Team, my junior and senior years." Williams turned to Rodriguez. Why wasn't this information in her file? Rodriguez looked genuinely puzzled as he flipped through the paperwork on his clipboard. Standard background check shows academy graduation and basic military training scores. Nothing about specialized marksmanship training or family military background beyond basic next-of-kin information. "Someone dropped the ball," Williams said flatly. "This kind of background should have been flagged during initial assessment." He turned back to Sarah. "What other relevant training have you received that might not be reflected in your official records?" Sarah took a breath before answering. This was where things were going to get interesting. High-altitude training in Colorado and Wyoming. Desert survival training in Nevada and Arizona. Cold weather operations training in Alaska. Advanced climbing and rope work certification. Underwater demolition training with private contractors in Florida. The silence in the room deepened with each item she listed. These weren't just hobbies or weekend activities. They were the specialized skill sets that distinguished elite special operations personnel from regular military service members. "Why isn't any of this documented?" Rodriguez asked, genuine confusion in his voice. "Because I paid for it myself," Sarah replied simply. "Private training, civilian instructors, personal time during leave periods. Nothing that would appear in official military records." Master Chief Williams studied her carefully. "That kind of training isn't cheap. We're talking about tens of thousands of dollars in specialized instruction." "Yes, Master Chief. Most junior officers can barely afford to keep their cars running, let alone finance advanced military training." "How did you manage it?" Sarah had known this question would come eventually. "Academic scholarships covered my education costs. Summer employment with private security contractors provided additional income. I spent virtually every vacation and leave period training instead of taking conventional time off." Williams exchanged a look with Rodriguez. They were both beginning to understand that they were dealing with something unusual. Not just a female candidate who had performed well on a challenging exercise, but someone who had spent years systematically preparing for exactly this kind of evaluation. "Private security contractors," Williams repeated. What kind of work? Consultation on facility security assessments. Range training for executive protection teams. Occasional instruction for law enforcement sniper programs. The room was getting warmer, and Sarah could see several of the candidates shifting uncomfortably. She knew what they were thinking. If she had this kind of background and training, why hadn't she mentioned it before? Why had she allowed them to assume she was just another academy graduate trying to prove she belonged? Petty Officer Jackson, who had been quiet since his earlier comments, finally spoke up. So you're saying you've basically been preparing for SEAL training your entire adult life? I'm saying I've been preparing to serve my country as effectively as possible, Sarah replied evenly. That's not the same thing, Jackson pressed. You let us think you were just some academy grad who got lucky enough to be selected for the program. You never mentioned that your father is a legendary Marine sniper or that you've been training with private contractors. I wasn't asked, Sarah said simply. The tension in the room ratcheted up several notches. Williams could see where this was heading, and he knew it was territory that needed to be navigated carefully. Stand down, petty officer, he commanded quietly, but his voice carried absolute authority. Jackson immediately fell silent, though his face remained flushed with anger or embarrassment. Williams turned his attention back to Sarah. The question that needs to be addressed is whether your background provides an unfair advantage in this assessment process. Sarah had been expecting this question since the moment she decided to pursue SEAL training. Master Chief, with respect, every candidate brings different background experiences to this program. Some grew up hunting in rural environments. Some played competitive sports that developed specific physical skills. Some serve in combat units that provided relevant experience. That's different, another candidate interjected. Those are normal life experiences. What you're describing is systematic preparation specifically for special operations training. Sarah turned to face the candidate who had spoken. Is it your position that I should be penalized for being well-prepared? The question hung in the air like smoke. Williams could see that they were approaching dangerous territory, the kind of conversation that could quickly devolve into accusations and resentments that would poison the training environment for everyone involved. Here's what's going to happen, Williams announced, taking control of the situation. This exercise is complete. Chun passed with exceptional scores. The rest of you will complete the exercise according to the original schedule. He paused, looking around the room. Any candidate who has concerns about the fairness or validity of another candidate's performance is welcome to discuss those concerns with me privately. But those discussions will not take place in group settings where they might affect unit cohesion. The dismissal was clear, but Williams wasn't finished. Let me be absolutely clear about something else. The purpose of this training is to identify and develop the most capable special operations personnel possible. We are not here to ensure that everyone gets an equal chance or that no one's feelings get hurt. We are here to find the people who can complete impossible missions and bring their teammates home alive. He stood up, his presence dominating the cramped room. If any of you have a problem with that mission, you're welcome to request transfer back to conventional forces. Otherwise, I suggest you focus on your own performance instead of worrying about someone else's qualifications. The group began filing out of the monitor room, but Williams gestured for Sarah to remain behind. When the room had cleared except for Rodriguez and Williams, the Master Chief closed the door and turned to face her. Off the record, Williams said quietly, that was one hell of a performance out there. Thank you, Master Chief. But we have a problem, he continued. Your background is going to create issues with some of the other candidates. They're going to feel like they're competing against someone who had access to advantages they didn't have. Sarah nodded. She had anticipated this challenge from the beginning. What would you recommend, Master Chief? Williams was quiet for a moment, considering his options. Honestly, part of me wants to recommend that you be moved to an advanced training track where your skills would be appropriately challenged. But that would create other problems. It would look like special treatment, and it would deprive you of the team-building experience that's crucial for special operations effectiveness. I want to complete the standard program, Sarah said firmly. I want to earn my place the same way everyone else does. even if it means dealing with resentment and suspicion from your fellow candidates. Sarah thought about her father's words again. Excuses are just fear wearing a disguise. Yes, Master Chief. Even then, Williams studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, you'll continue with the regular training schedule. But I'm going to give you some advice. Watch your six. Some of these candidates are going to be looking for ways to prove that your performance today was a fluke or that you can't handle other aspects of the training. Understood, Master Chief. And Chun, Williams called as she turned to leave. Yes, Master Chief. Don't let up. If you've got the skills to dominate these exercises, then dominate them. The best thing you can do for yourself and for this program is to prove that today wasn't an accident. Sarah left the observation tower and walked back toward the barracks, conscious of the conversations that stopped when she passed and resumed in whispers after she had moved on. She knew that the real challenge was just beginning. Completing the sniper exercise in record time had solved one problem, but it had created several others. As she reached her quarters, she could hear voices from the common area, her fellow candidates discussing the morning's events. The tone was different now, more serious, more concerned. They were beginning to understand that the woman they had dismissed as a diversity candidate might actually represent a threat to their own chances of making it through the program. Sarah closed her door and sat down on her narrow bunk, finally, allowing herself a moment to process what had happened. She had achieved exactly what she had hoped to achieve, a perfect demonstration of her capabilities that would force the other candidates and the instructors to take her seriously. But as she listened to the ongoing conversation in the next room, she realized that she had also painted a target on her back. From this point forward, every mistake would be magnified, every success would be scrutinized, and every interaction with her fellow candidates would be colored by the knowledge that she might be more dangerous than any of them had imagined. The mockery was over. Now came the real test. 3 weeks after the sniper exercise, the training had evolved into something more complex and dangerous. The candidates were no longer working individual challenges. They were functioning as units, learning to operate as teams under extreme pressure. It was during this phase that the real tensions began to surface. Sarah found herself assigned to Team Alpha, along with Petty Officers Jackson, Martinez, Thompson, and Morrison. The irony wasn't lost on her. Jackson, who had been the most vocal critic of her presence in the program, was now her team leader. The assignment felt deliberate, as if the instructors wanted to see how the group dynamics would play out under operational stress. Their current exercise was a hostage rescue simulation that required the team to infiltrate a multi-story building, neutralize hostile forces, and extract 3 civilian captives without casualties. The scenario was designed to test not just individual skills, but the ability to work together under pressure, communicate effectively, and make split-second decisions that affected the entire team. All right, listen up, Jackson said as the team huddled behind their insertion vehicle. Building has 4 floors, multiple entry points, and an unknown number of hostile forces. Intelligence suggests the hostages are being held on the 3rd floor, but we can't confirm exact locations. Sarah studied the building through her scope, identifying potential sniper positions and escape routes. The structure was a maze of windows, balconies, and rooftop access points, exactly the kind of complex environment where things could go wrong quickly. I count at least 6 positions where enemy snipers could be positioned, she observed quietly. Windows on the 2nd and 4th floors, plus rooftop access. Jackson nodded curtly. Martinez and Thompson, you take the ground floor and work your way up. Morrison, you're with me on the 2nd floor. Chun. He paused, and Sarah could see the internal debate playing out on his face. Chun, you take Overwatch position. Keep us covered during insertion and extraction. It was a safe assignment, Sarah realized. Overwatch meant she would be positioned outside the building, providing long-range cover for the team, but not directly involved in the close-quarters combat that would determine the success or failure of the mission. It was the kind of assignment you gave to someone you didn't trust to perform under pressure, or someone you wanted to keep away from the real action. Overwatch position won't give me clear sight lines to the third floor, Sarah pointed out. If the hostages are in interior rooms, I won't be able to provide effective support during the extraction. That's not your concern, Jackson replied firmly. Your job is perimeter security. We'll handle the extraction. Sarah bit back her first response, recognizing that challenging the team leader's decision in front of the other team members would create exactly the kind of conflict that the instructors were probably hoping to observe. Instead, she nodded and moved toward the position Jackson had indicated. From her elevated position behind a concrete barrier, Sarah had an excellent view of the building's exterior and most of the surrounding area. She could see movement in several windows. The role players representing hostile forces were taking their positions for the exercise. Through her scope, she identified 4 definite threats and 2 possible additional positions. Alpha 1, this is Overwatch, she reported over the team radio. I have eyes on 4 confirmed hostile positions. Second floor, northeast window. Third floor, center window and southwest corner. Fourth floor, northwest window. 2 additional possible positions on the roof. Copy that, Overwatch. Jackson's voice crackled through her earpiece. Beginning insertion now. Sarah watched through her scope as the 4-man team approached the building from 2 different angles. Their movement was professional and coordinated, the result of weeks of intensive training in close-quarters combat techniques. But she could also see something that they couldn't: additional movement in the building that suggested more hostile forces than their intelligence had indicated. Alpha 1, be advised, she reported. I'm seeing additional movement on all floors. Possible hostile count is higher than briefed. Overwatch, maintain position, and report only confirmed threats, Jackson replied tersely. The team disappeared into the building, and Sarah's role became more challenging. She could no longer see her teammates directly, but she could track their progress by observing the reactions of the hostile forces in the windows above them. It was like watching a chess game where she could only see one side of the board. The first shots came from the second floor, brief, controlled bursts that indicated the team had made contact with hostile forces. Sarah adjusted her scope, trying to identify targets she could engage to support the team, but the angles were wrong. Most of the activity was happening in interior rooms where she had no sight lines. Alpha 1, what's your status? She called over the radio. We're encountering heavier resistance than expected, Martinez's voice replied, slightly out of breath. Multiple hostiles on every floor. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from several windows now, indicating that the hostile forces were engaging the team from multiple directions. This wasn't the scenario they had briefed. It was significantly more complex and dangerous. Overwatch to Alpha 1, she called urgently. You have hostile forces moving to cut off your exit route. Ground floor, rear entrance. At least 3 individuals with automatic weapons. Can you engage? Jackson asked. Sarah studied the situation through her scope. The hostile forces were moving through an area that was partially concealed from her position, but she had intermittent sight lines as they moved between cover points. Negative on direct engagement, she reported. Limited sight lines from current position. There was a pause in radio communication, filled only with the sound of gunfire from within the building. Sarah could see that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The team was pinned down on the second floor. Hostile forces were converging on their position, and their planned extraction route was being cut off. Alpha 1, you need to abort, Sarah called over the radio. Too many unknowns. Extraction route compromised. Negative, Overwatch, Jackson replied. We're proceeding with the mission. Sarah realized that Jackson was making the wrong decision for the wrong reasons. He was refusing to abort the mission not because it was tactically sound, but because retreating would look like failure, and failure would reflect poorly on his leadership abilities. It was exactly the kind of ego-driven decision-making that got people killed in real operations. She watched through her scope as more hostile forces moved into position around the building. The exercise was designed to be challenging, but completable. What she was seeing suggested that the role players were improvising additional complications that hadn't been part of the original scenario. Alpha 1, be advised, she reported. Hostile forces are not following expected patterns. This may not be the brief scenario. Overwatch, maintain your position, and provide updates only, Jackson ordered. But Sarah was no longer watching just the building. She was scanning the entire area around the training site, looking for something that had been nagging at her since the exercise began. The level of resistance they were encountering, the way the hostile forces were moving, the complexity of the tactical situation, it all felt wrong for a standard training exercise. That's when she saw them. 300 meters away, positioned on a ridge that overlooked the entire training area, she spotted the reflection of scope lenses. Real snipers, not role players. They were positioned to observe the exercise, but their locations and equipment suggested something more than passive observation. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she realized what was happening. This wasn't just a training exercise, it was an evaluation. The real test wasn't whether the team could complete the hostage rescue scenario. The real test was how they would respond when the scenario went completely wrong. Alpha 1, she called urgently. We have a bigger problem. Overwatch, I told you to maintain position, and Jackson, shut up and listen, Sarah interrupted, abandoning radio protocol entirely. This isn't the exercise we briefed. We're being evaluated on crisis response, not hostage rescue. The scenario is designed to go wrong. There was silence on the radio for a moment. Then Jackson's voice came back, angry and confused. What the hell are you talking about? The hostile forces aren't following the script because they're not supposed to. The scenario is designed to be unwinnable as briefed. They want to see how we adapt when everything goes to hell. Sarah could hear gunfire intensifying inside the building, and she made a decision that would either save her team or end her career. She abandoned her assigned Overwatch position and began moving toward the building at a run, carrying her rifle and additional equipment. Overwatch, return to position immediately, Jackson ordered over the radio. Negative, Alpha 1, Sarah replied as she reached the building's perimeter. I'm coming in. Chun, that's a direct order. Court-martial me later, Sarah replied, and switched her radio to a different channel. She had spent the previous 3 weeks studying not just the training scenarios, but the training facility itself. She knew there were maintenance tunnels beneath the building complex, utility access points that weren't part of the official building plans, but were visible to anyone who took the time to look carefully. Sarah reached a service entrance that led to the building's basement level. The door was supposed to be locked, but she had noticed during her reconnaissance that the lock mechanism was old and poorly maintained. It took her less than 30 seconds to defeat it using techniques her father had taught her years earlier. The basement was dark and filled with mechanical equipment that serviced the building's utilities. But more importantly, it connected to the maintenance tunnels that ran beneath the entire training complex. Sarah moved through the tunnels quickly, using a small flashlight to navigate toward the building where her team was trapped. She emerged in the basement of the target building, directly beneath the area where the hostile forces were positioned. Through the ceiling, she could hear the ongoing firefight on the floors above her. Her radio crackled with confused updates from her team members, who were trying to coordinate their movements while under heavy fire from multiple directions. The building's basement contained the electrical and mechanical systems that powered the entire structure. Sarah studied the layout quickly, identifying the main power distribution panel and the emergency lighting systems. If she could cut the power to the building, it would level the playing field considerably. Her team had night vision equipment, but most of the role players representing hostile forces did not. But cutting the power would also affect the safety systems that were monitoring the exercise. If anything went wrong, the training supervisors wouldn't be able to track what was happening inside the building. It was exactly the kind of improvisation that could get her kicked out of the program, but it might also save her team from failing the exercise entirely. Sarah made her decision. She disabled the main power supply to the building, plunging the entire structure into darkness. Emergency lighting kicked in immediately, providing minimal illumination in the stairwells and exits, but leaving most of the interior spaces in near total darkness. The change was immediate and dramatic. The gunfire from the upper floors became sporadic and confused as the hostile forces lost visual contact with their targets. Sarah activated her night vision equipment and began moving through the building using maintenance stairwells that weren't part of the main floor plan. Alpha Team, this is Chun, she called over the radio. Power is down throughout the building. Switch to night vision and prepare for extraction. Chun, where the hell are you? Jackson demanded. Inside the building, moving to support your position. Sarah reached the second floor through a maintenance access that emerged behind the hostile forces who had been engaging her team. Through her night vision equipment, she could see them struggling to adapt to the sudden darkness, their movements confused and uncoordinated. What happened next demonstrated why Sarah's father had insisted on training her not just in marksmanship, but in close-quarters combat and tactical movement. She moved through the dark building like a ghost, using her night vision advantage to systematically eliminate the hostile forces that had been pinning down her team. She didn't use her rifle. The muzzle flashes would have given away her position. Instead, she used a combination of non-lethal takedown techniques and simulated knife work to neutralize the targets silently and efficiently. Within 10 minutes, she had cleared a path for her team to reach the third floor where the hostages were being held. She had also eliminated more than half of the hostile forces that had been making the mission impossible. Alpha 1, path to third floor is clear, she reported over the radio. Hostiles neutralized, proceeding to hostage location. The silence on the radio stretched for several seconds before Jackson responded. How many hostiles did you engage? 8 confirmed eliminations, Sarah replied as she continued moving through the building. Area is secure for your advance. She reached the third floor ahead of her team and quickly identified the room where the hostages were being held. 2 hostile forces were guarding the door, but they were struggling with the darkness and didn't see her approach until it was too late. By the time the rest of Alpha Team reached the third floor, Sarah had already secured the hostage location and was preparing for extraction. The 3 role players representing civilian captives were secured and ready for movement. Hostages secured, she reported. Ready for extraction. Jackson and the rest of the team arrived at the hostage location looking somewhat shell-shocked. They had gone from being pinned down and facing possible mission failure to having a clear path to success, and the transition had happened so quickly that they were still processing what had occurred. How did you? Martinez began, then stopped himself. Emergency exit route through the east stairwell, Sarah reported. Clear path to extraction point. The team moved through the building toward their extraction point, encountering no resistance. Sarah had either eliminated or bypassed every hostile force that might have threatened their withdrawal. The exercise that had seemed impossible 20 minutes earlier was now proceeding smoothly toward a successful conclusion. As they reached the extraction point, Sarah could see the training supervisors waiting for them with expressions that mixed surprise, concern, and something that might have been admiration. Master Chief Williams was among them, his weathered face unreadable as he watched the team emerge from the building. Exercise complete, Commander Rodriguez announced as the team reached the designated safe area. Mission successful. All hostages extracted, 0 casualties. But Sarah could see in the instructors' faces that the real evaluation was just beginning. She had achieved mission success, but she had also completely abandoned the assigned tactical plan and improvised a solution that hadn't been part of any training manual. As the adrenaline began to fade, she realized that she had just taken the biggest risk of her military career. She had either proven that she could adapt and lead under impossible circumstances, or she had demonstrated that she was unwilling to follow orders and work within established chains of command. The next few hours would determine which interpretation would define her future in the program. The debriefing room was smaller than Sarah had expected, with fluorescent lighting that cast harsh shadows across the metal table where she sat alone. For the past hour, she had been waiting while the instructors reviewed the footage from the exercise and discussed her performance. Through the thin walls, she could hear muffled conversations from the adjacent rooms where the other team members were being questioned separately. Master Chief Williams entered the room carrying a thick folder and a cup of coffee that had probably been cooling for the better part of the morning. His expression was neutral, giving no indication of whether she was about to be commended or removed from the program. "Before we begin," Williams said as he took a seat across from her, "I want you to understand that this conversation will determine whether you continue in this program or return to conventional naval service. Are we clear?" "Yes, Master Chief." Williams opened the folder and spread out several photographs that had been taken during the exercise. They showed different angles of the building, thermal imaging captures of her movement through the maintenance tunnels, and timeline reconstructions of her actions during the mission. "Let's start with the obvious question," Williams began. "You were given a direct order to maintain Overwatch position. You abandoned that position and entered the building without authorization. Explain your reasoning." Sarah had known this question was coming, and she had spent the past hour considering how to answer it honestly without sounding insubordinate or reckless. "Master Chief, the scenario as briefed was not the scenario we encountered. The level of resistance, the tactical complexity, and the behavior of the hostile forces indicated that we were facing a different type of evaluation than what had been described during the mission briefing." "That doesn't answer my question," Williams replied firmly. "You were given orders. You chose to ignore them." "Why?" Sarah took a breath before responding. "Because following those orders would have resulted in mission failure and potential casualties among my team members." Williams leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. "Potential casualties in a training exercise?" "Master Chief, the exercise was designed to escalate beyond the parameters we had been given. The role players were not following the expected script. My team was pinned down with no viable extraction route. If the situation had been real, they would have been killed or captured. But it wasn't real," Williams pointed out. "It was a training exercise with specific learning objectives and safety protocols. With respect, Master Chief, I don't believe that's entirely accurate." Williams raised an eyebrow. "Explain." Sarah had been thinking about this since the moment she spotted the real snipers on the ridge overlooking the exercise area. The snipers positioned on the ridge weren't part of the standard exercise setup. Their equipment and positioning suggested real-time evaluation rather than passive observation. The complexity of the tactical situation exceeded anything we had encountered in previous training scenarios. "You observed the evaluation team?" Williams asked, and Sarah caught something in his tone that suggested surprise. "Yes, Master Chief. 3 positions on the ridge, approximately 300 meters from the exercise area. Standard observation would have been conducted from the designated training tower." Williams was quiet for a moment, making notes in the margin of one of the photographs. "Continue with your explanation of events." Sarah described her decision to enter the building through the maintenance tunnels, her assessment of the electrical systems, and her systematic elimination of the hostile forces that had been preventing her team from completing their mission. As she spoke, Williams occasionally nodded or asked clarifying questions, but his expression remained neutral. "According to the exercise monitors," Williams said when she had finished, "you eliminated 14 hostile forces in approximately 12 minutes. Some of those eliminations occurred in areas where we had no camera coverage. The maintenance areas and utility spaces weren't covered by the standard surveillance system," Sarah acknowledged. "How did you know that?" "I studied the building layout during my free time over the past 3 weeks. I wanted to understand the tactical environment we might be operating in." Williams set down his pen and looked at her directly. "You've been conducting reconnaissance on our training facilities?" Sarah realized she might have just admitted to something that could be interpreted as a security violation. "Not reconnaissance, Master Chief. Familiarization. I wanted to understand the environments we were training in so I could perform more effectively." "Without permission from the training staff?" "I didn't realize permission was required to walk around the exterior of buildings during off-duty hours." Williams was quiet for several long moments, reviewing the photographs and timeline documents. Sarah could hear voices from the hallway outside, but couldn't make out the words being spoken. "Let me tell you what the other instructors think happened," Williams said finally. "They think you deliberately ignored orders to showcase your individual capabilities at the expense of team cohesion. They think you put your desire to prove yourself ahead of the mission objectives and the chain of command. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. If that was the official assessment, her career in special operations was over before it had really begun. "What do you think happened, Master Chief?" she asked quietly. Williams was silent for a moment longer, then closed the folder and leaned forward. "I think you identified a tactical situation that was beyond your team's current capabilities, adapted to changing circumstances, and achieved mission success using improvised methods that probably saved the exercise from complete failure." Relief flooded through Sarah, but she kept her expression neutral. "However," Williams continued, and her relief evaporated. "The way you achieve that success raises serious concerns about your ability to function within a team structure and follow orders under pressure." "Master Chief, if I may," Williams held up a hand, cutting her off. "I'm not finished. The reality of special operations is that sometimes the situation on the ground doesn't match the intelligence you were given. Sometimes the mission parameters change in real time. Sometimes you have to make decisions that your chain of command can't make because they don't have access to current information." Sarah nodded, recognizing the truth in what he was saying. But Williams emphasized those decisions have to be made for the right reasons and communicated effectively to maintain unit cohesion. You can't just go off and do your own thing without explaining your reasoning to your team leader. "You're right, Master Chief. I should have communicated my assessment more clearly before taking independent action." More importantly, Williams continued, "you need to understand that your teammates are now questioning whether they can trust you to follow orders in a real operational environment. Some of them think you're more concerned with proving your superiority than with being part of a team." This was the crux of the problem, Sarah realized. Her performance in the exercises had been exceptional, but it had also isolated her from the other candidates. They saw her not as a valuable team member, but as someone who might abandon them if she thought she had a better plan. "What would you recommend, Master Chief?" Williams stood up and walked to the small window that looked out onto the training grounds. "Honestly, part of me thinks you should be fast-tracked to advanced training. Your individual capabilities are at a level that exceeds what we normally see from candidates at this stage. But special operations isn't about individual capability. It's about teams of highly skilled people working together to achieve objectives that no single person could accomplish alone." He turned back to face her. "If you can't function effectively as part of a team, then it doesn't matter how skilled you are individually." Sarah understood what he was telling her. The next phase of her training would be less about proving her individual capabilities and more about proving that she could be trusted by the people who might someday depend on her in life or death situations. "I want to continue with the program," she said firmly. "I want to learn to be a better team member." Williams studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, but understand that you're going to be under increased scrutiny from this point forward. Every interaction with your fellow candidates, every decision you make, every exercise you participate in, it's all going to be evaluated not just for individual performance, but for team integration." "I understand, Master Chief." "There's one more thing," Williams added as he prepared to leave the room. "The exercise yesterday wasn't just about hostage rescue. It was about adaptive leadership under changing circumstances. The scenario was designed to test how teams respond when their original plan becomes impossible to execute." Sarah had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made her feel somewhat vindicated. "Your team failed the original parameters," Williams continued, "but they succeeded in the larger objective because you were able to adapt and improvise. The question is whether you can learn to do that while maintaining team cohesion and chain of command protocols." "I believe I can, Master Chief." Williams paused at the door. "I hope so, because we've got 3 more months of training ahead of us, and the exercises are only going to get more complex and more challenging. If you can't learn to balance individual excellence with team effectiveness, you'll wash out regardless of how skilled you are." After Williams left, Sarah remained alone in the debriefing room for several more minutes, processing what she had learned. She had passed the exercise, but she had also created new challenges for herself that would be harder to overcome than any physical or technical test. When she finally left the room and walked back toward the barracks, she could see small groups of her fellow candidates talking quietly among themselves. The conversation stopped when she approached and resumed after she had passed. It was a familiar pattern, but the quality of the attention had changed again. They were no longer dismissing her as incompetent or questioning whether she belonged in the program. Now they were questioning whether she could be trusted to work with them as an equal rather than trying to prove her superiority at their expense. As she reached her quarters, Petty Officer Jackson appeared in the hallway. He had obviously been waiting for her, and his expression was serious but not hostile. "We need to talk," he said simply. Sarah nodded. She had been expecting this conversation since the moment the exercise ended. They walked to a quiet area near the training grounds where they could speak without being overheard by other candidates or instructors. Jackson was quiet for several moments before speaking, and Sarah could see that he was carefully considering his words. "What you did yesterday," he began, then stopped and started over. "The way you handled that situation was impressive, but it was also problematic." "I know," Sarah replied. "I should have communicated better with you before taking independent action." Jackson shook his head. "It's not just about communication. It's about trust. When you abandoned your assigned position and went into that building alone, you put all of us at risk." "How?" Sarah asked, genuinely confused. "Because we didn't know where you were or what you were doing. For all we knew, you had been captured or killed. We were operating blind while you were eliminating threats we didn't even know existed." Sarah realized that she hadn't considered this perspective. From her viewpoint, she had been providing effective support for her team. From their viewpoint, she had disappeared without explanation and left them wondering if they needed to mount a rescue operation. "You're right," she acknowledged. "I was focused on solving the tactical problem, but I didn't consider how my actions would affect team coordination." "Exactly," Jackson said. "And in a real operation, that kind of confusion can get people killed." They stood in silence for a moment, watching other training teams practice small unit tactics on the nearby range. Sarah could see that Jackson was struggling with something else, and she waited for him to work through whatever he needed to say. "Look," he said finally, "none of us are questioning your abilities anymore. What you did in that building yesterday, most of us couldn't have pulled that off even if we'd had the same opportunities you did. But," Sarah prompted, "but we need to know that you're part of the team, not just someone who happens to be wearing the same uniform. We need to know that you'll have our backs instead of thinking you can handle everything yourself." Sarah understood what he was asking for. It wasn't about demonstrating her capabilities. She had already done that. It was about demonstrating her commitment to the people she would be serving with. "How do I prove that?" she asked. Jackson was quiet for a moment, then looked at her directly. "I don't know. But you need to figure out because the next exercises are going to require even more trust and coordination. If the team doesn't gel, we're all going to fail together." As Jackson walked away, Sarah remained by herself near the training grounds, watching the other teams practice their movements. She could see the fluid coordination between team members who trusted each other implicitly, who could anticipate each other's actions and work together seamlessly under pressure. She had proven that she could excel individually, but now she faced a much more difficult challenge. She needed to prove that she could excel as part of a team while maintaining the capabilities that made her valuable in the first place. The balance between individual excellence and team integration would determine not just her future in the program, but the kind of special operations professional she would become if she made it through the training. It was a challenge that couldn't be solved with superior marksmanship or tactical innovation. It required something much more complex and difficult to achieve. 6 weeks later, Sarah found herself crouched in a shallow depression in the Nevada desert, sharing a hide position with Jackson as they prepared for what would be their final exercise before graduation. The relationship between them had evolved considerably since their conversation after the hostage rescue simulation. Not quite friendship, but something approaching mutual respect based on shared experiences and proven reliability. The exercise was deceptively simple in concept. A 2-week survival and evasion scenario where teams of two would navigate hostile territory while avoiding capture by hunter-killer teams equipped with vehicles, helicopters, and thermal imaging equipment. The teams that made it to the extraction point within the time limit would graduate from the program. Those that didn't would return to conventional naval service. What made the exercise particularly challenging was that it wasn't just about individual survival skills. It required constant cooperation and decision-making between partners who might have very different approaches to problem-solving under extreme stress. Water situation? Jackson asked quietly as he scanned the terrain ahead of them through binoculars. Sarah checked her remaining supplies. 18 hours at current consumption rate. Maybe 24 if we ration strictly. They had been moving through the desert for 11 days, covering more than 200 kilometers while avoiding detection by the pursuit teams. The combination of extreme heat during the day, freezing temperatures at night, and constant vigilance had pushed both of them to their physical and mental limits. But something had changed in their working relationship over those 11 days. The initial tension and mutual suspicion had given way to a partnership based on complementary strengths and shared dependence. Jackson's expertise in desert navigation and survival techniques had kept them alive and moving in the right direction. Sarah's ability to spot and avoid the pursuit teams had kept them from being captured. Movement, 2 o'clock, Sarah reported softly, adjusting her scope to get a better view of the distant terrain. Jackson shifted his binoculars in that direction. Vehicle patrol, 3 Humvees, moving along the ridgeline. They watched in silence as the patrol moved past their position, close enough that they could hear the sound of engines and radio chatter. If the pursuit team had thermal imaging equipment, which they almost certainly did, then Sarah and Jackson's only protection was the camouflage shelter they had constructed using desert vegetation and reflective materials designed to mask their heat signatures. They're moving toward the water source, Jackson observed after the patrol had passed. The water source was a small spring approximately 8 kilometers ahead of them, the only reliable water within a day's travel. It was also exactly the kind of location where the pursuit teams would expect to find candidates who were running low on supplies. Ambush position? Sarah asked. Almost certainly, but we don't have enough water to bypass it and reach the next source. This was the kind of tactical problem that had no clean solution. They needed the water to survive, but approaching the spring would expose them to capture. It was exactly the sort of dilemma that the exercise was designed to create, a situation where survival required taking calculated risks based on incomplete information. Options, Jackson said, settling into the problem-solving mode that had served them well throughout the exercise. Sarah studied the terrain between their current position and the spring through her scope. Direct approach is suicide. They'll have overwatch positions covering all the obvious routes. Agreed. What about a night infiltration? Thermal imaging makes night movement almost as risky as day movement. Plus, we'd be approaching blind. No way to know exactly where they've positioned their people. Jackson was quiet for several minutes, considering alternatives. Sarah continued scanning the area, noting changes in the patrol patterns and trying to identify the most likely ambush positions around the water source. What if we don't approach the spring at all? Jackson said finally. Sarah lowered her scope and looked at him, meaning, what if we force them to come to us? Over the next hour, they developed a plan that was either tactically brilliant or completely insane, possibly both. Instead of trying to infiltrate the area around the spring, they would create a diversion that would draw the pursuit teams away from their ambush positions, giving Sarah and Jackson an opportunity to access the water source while the enemy was focused elsewhere. The plan required Sarah to position herself approximately 1 kilometer from the spring with a rifle, while Jackson moved to a concealed position much closer to the water source. At a predetermined time, Sarah would engage targets around the spring with precision fire, creating the impression that a team was attempting to fight their way through the ambush. The pursuit teams would focus their attention on neutralizing this apparent threat, giving Jackson the opportunity to move in and secure water for both of them. It was risky for multiple reasons. If Sarah missed her shots or failed to create a convincing diversion, Jackson would be trapped in an exposed position with no escape route. If the pursuit teams didn't react as expected, both of them could end up captured. And if anything went wrong with the timing or communication, they would be separated in hostile territory with no way to reconnect. But it was also the kind of adaptive, unconventional thinking that special operations missions sometimes required. Instead of trying to solve the problem the way the exercise designers expected, they were improvising a solution based on their specific capabilities and circumstances. "You sure about this?" Jackson asked as they prepared to move into position. Sarah checked her rifle one final time, ensuring that her scope was properly zeroed and her ammunition was readily accessible. The alternative is trying to last another 4 days without water while avoiding pursuit teams who know exactly where we need to go. Jackson nodded grimly. They both understood that this was their best chance, possibly their only chance, of completing the exercise successfully. As the sun began to set, they moved into their respective positions. Sarah found a concealed location on a ridge that gave her excellent sight lines to the area around the spring, while Jackson worked his way through a series of arroyos that would allow him to approach the water source from an unexpected direction. Through her scope, Sarah could see the pursuit team's positions clearly. They had positioned themselves exactly where she had expected, overwatch positions covering the most likely approach routes, with additional teams positioned to cut off escape routes once candidates were detected. It was a professional setup that would be nearly impossible to defeat using conventional tactics. At exactly 2,200 hours, Sarah began engaging targets around the spring. Her shots were deliberately placed to create maximum confusion and concern among the pursuit teams without actually endangering anyone. She put rounds into equipment, vehicles, and structures, creating the impression of a determined assault while avoiding any shots that might injure the role players. The response was immediate and dramatic. The pursuit teams reacted exactly as Sarah and Jackson had hoped, focusing their attention on locating and neutralizing the sniper who was engaging them from long range. Vehicles moved to cut off potential escape routes. Personnel shifted to counter-sniper positions, and radio traffic increased dramatically as the teams coordinated their response to the apparent threat. While the pursuit teams were focused on dealing with Sarah's diversionary fire, Jackson moved through the darkness toward the spring. His approach took him through terrain that would normally be covered by overwatch positions, but those positions had been abandoned as their occupants moved to respond to the sniper threat. Sarah continued her harassment fire for exactly 20 minutes, then ceased fire and began moving to a new position. The pursuit teams would eventually realize that the sniper fire had stopped and would begin searching for her previous position, but by then, she would be long gone. Jackson reached the spring and was able to fill both of their water containers without detection. The pursuit teams were still focused on the ridge line where Sarah had been firing, giving him the time he needed to secure the water and withdraw to a safe distance. They reconnected at a predetermined rally point 3 hours later, both exhausted but successful. Jackson carried enough water to sustain them for the remaining 3 days of the exercise, while Sarah had proven that they could outthink and outmaneuver pursuit teams using tactics that weren't in any training manual. "Think it worked?" Jackson asked as they prepared to move to their next high position. Sarah was studying the distant glow of vehicle headlights around the spring area, where the pursuit teams were still searching for traces of their presence. "They're still looking in all the wrong places." "I'd say it worked." Over the final 3 days of the exercise, they encountered 2 more pursuit teams, but avoided detection both times. Their water supplies held out, their navigation remained accurate, and their coordination continued to improve as they adapted to each other's strengths and compensated for each other's weaknesses. When they finally reached the extraction point on the 14th day, they found Master Chief Williams waiting for them along with a helicopter that would transport them back to the training center. Williams' expression was unreadable as they approached, but Sarah could see something in his posture that suggested satisfaction. "Congratulations. Williams said simply as they reached the designated extraction area. "You're the third team to successfully complete the exercise." Sarah felt a surge of relief and exhaustion that was almost overwhelming. 14 days of constant stress, physical hardship, and tactical challenges had pushed her further than she had ever been pushed before, but they had made it through successfully. "How did the water source operation go?" Williams asked as they prepared to board the helicopter. Sarah and Jackson exchanged glances. They had assumed their diversionary action around the spring would be observed and evaluated, but they hadn't been certain. "Successfully, Master Chief," Jackson replied. "Objective achieved without detection." Williams nodded slowly. "Interesting tactical solution. Not what we expected, but effective nonetheless." As the helicopter lifted off and began the flight back to the training center, Sarah looked out at the desert terrain they had crossed over the past 2 weeks. It looked different from the air, less threatening, more manageable. But she knew that the experience of crossing it on foot had changed her in ways that would take time to fully understand. "So what happens now?" Jackson asked over the noise of the helicopter engines. Williams leaned forward so he could be heard clearly. "Now you graduate. Final ceremony is tomorrow morning, followed by assignment notifications." Sarah realized that she hadn't thought much about assignments during the intensity of the final exercise. The focus had been entirely on making it through each day, each challenge, each test of survival and tactical thinking. "Any indication of where we might be assigned?" she asked. Williams looked at her with an expression that might have been amusement. "Let's just say that your performance has been noticed by people who make decisions about special assignments." The helicopter ride back to the training center gave Sarah time to reflect on everything that had happened over the past 6 months. She had started the program as someone who needed to prove that she belonged, fighting against assumptions and prejudices while demonstrating her individual capabilities. She was ending the program as someone who had learned to balance individual excellence with team effectiveness, someone who could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining the trust and confidence of the people she served with. The mockery and dismissive comments were now a distant memory. They had been replaced by mutual respect based on proven performance under pressure, shared hardships, and successful mission completion. As the training center came into view below them, Sarah realized that the real test hadn't been whether she could excel as an individual operator. The real test had been whether she could become the kind of person that other elite operators would trust with their lives in the most dangerous and demanding circumstances imaginable. The answer, apparently, was yes. But she also understood that graduation from the training program was just the beginning. The real challenges would come when she was deployed to operational units where the stakes would be real and the margin for error would be measured in lives rather than training scores. The helicopter touched down at the training center, and Sarah stepped out onto the familiar tarmac where her journey had begun 6 months earlier. She was no longer the person who had arrived here uncertain about whether she would be accepted or respected by her peers. She was now a member of one of the most elite military organizations in the world, someone who had earned her place through demonstrated performance rather than political considerations or lowered standards. The mocking had stopped long ago. Now came the real work.